Well, today I think I'd like to continue talking about this situation in Portland, because yesterday I focused on something very specific. It was just sort of the matter of people being black bagged and thrown into the back of unmarked vans and sped away to some unknown location where they would be presumably interrogated by the authorities. I had, made the case yesterday that I don't really have a big problem with that from a libertarian standpoint. As long as it's not being done to innocent people, and of course, if someone who didn't do anything wrong was arrested without probable cause or something like that, I think they should sue and win their case and all that. But beyond that, there's a much broader issue here, and that is, what exactly is going on with these riots in Portland? What do these folks hope to achieve? As I sort of touched upon yesterday briefly, I think this is very far detached from the whole Black Lives Matter thing at this point. Obviously, it being Portland, this is going to be mostly white Antifa folks anyway. And so in order to understand this situation, I really have to try and look at things through their perspective. Now, I know what they've been saying online. What they've been saying is, this is the revolution. They're waging an insurrection against the evil imperialist U.S. government. Instead of going up against Zog, like the far right-wingers, they're going up against WSOG, which is, instead of the Zionist occupation government, they've got the white supremacist occupation government. And they've said as such, and not just the far left, but even, normal elected Democratic politicians have been saying that, the feds are occupying Portland, Oregon. The resistance crowd has now jumped in on this. This is becoming a mainstream idea that, Trump is sending in his jackbooted thugs, and that they are, conquering the people of Portland. And I have to say, this actually kind of warms my heart. I'm happy to see the left taking this sort of attack, even though I think it's disingenuous and that they would never feel the same way if the shoe was on the other foot, and if some right-wingers were waging an insurgency against the federal government. I think that the left would be the first folks to throw them under the bus and to cheer on whatever actions the feds took, no matter how atrocious. And while I still wouldn't do that, I don't think that the feds have committed any atrocities yet. It's still refreshing to see left-wingers be so opposed to the federal government, I guess just in the name of Orange Man Bad. But this is something that hopefully will have a bit of a long-term of an impact on the left, and maybe folks will start to be a little more skeptical of the federal government. Maybe, just maybe, they'll grow resentful of it, in general, not just of Trump, but of the feds overall. I would very much like to see a movement in this country to where the left says, hey, we want to control our own areas, we don't want these feds out of here, because, then you would start to have a growing consensus in this country that the federal government is bad and that they shouldn't be here and that they need to go away. Unfortunately, because of the polarized nature of our politics, if the left started to eschew the federal government, right-wingers likely would begin to embrace it more and more, because, they would see the feds as sort of being on their side. That is, at least until there's a Democrat president. Nevertheless, this sort of escalation in rhetoric, does serve a purpose, I think, in discrediting the federal government overall, because if people every 4 years decide that the federal government is either their best friend or an occupying foreign power, that serves to discredit the feds overall. It will become difficult more and more for people to unsee that sort of perspective. You don't just go from seeing these folks as an occupying power to seeing them as your best friend without some lingering thoughts. Because as it stands right now, I think if you asked a lot of the folks in Portland, they'd be very much ready to secede. Of course, a lot of them are self-proclaimed anarchists who don't believe in any state. So I wouldn't really worry too much about about what they have to say, since they will always be, a small fringe. But the your resistance types, your mainstream Democrats, they might be opening up to the idea of secession, saying, well, look how bad Orange Man is. We voted really hard in 2016, and maybe they're going to vote again. They're going to vote even harder in 2020, and it may not make a difference. If old Trump is still there in January, and he, goes through a second inauguration, I mean, what is the resistance going to do? How can they resist? If they've already voted as hard as they can and they lost twice, they can't vote him out, because then he'll just be term limited. But by then, maybe he'll seize power and be a dictator. I mean, he does have his own Gestapo. He's sending in jackbooted thugs to Portland to beat up the resistance. Maybe the only choice the Fed will, or not the Fed, we're not talking about the Federal Reserve today, the only choice the left will have left after this election, if they lose, is to secede. And I have to say, I know we're a long way from that. That right now, if you even use the word secede, you get called a neo-Confederate for considering the idea, even if you don't support it yourself. But as people become more disenchanted with the flag, flag burning is not exactly the most controversial thing you can do anymore. Or I should say, at least it's not the most universally appalled thing in the world. There's a lot of people who might nod their head at a flag burning. All those people do not believe in the myth of the insoluble union that was propped up or perhaps invented by Abraham Lincoln and others. There is a growing chorus of Americans who would like to see the Union dissolved, even though they can't come right out and say it, because that's such taboo in our society. Even in the wake of Trump, on the mainstream right, people like Jesse Kelly and Kurt Schlichter, which, they're not Conservatism Inc. folks, but they're not far-righters by any means, they and others have been sort of on the right, even with Trump in office, have been saying, you know what, this whole thing of having a united states of America doesn't really work out well. We've got a lot of differences, and we're not really going to settle them with some big national election. So both sides are moving towards a rejection of our political system. Of course, you've got the left openly calling for a political revolution. I mean, why not, have that revolution be in the form of a new union of democratic socialist republics? Of course, you might be saying, well, it's just Oregon at this point. I mean, what are you getting so upset about? The riots have largely slowed in other places. There aren't people, and in other places it was over the Black Lives Matter stuff, and they don't really have the most coherent political agenda. But I don't think that's the case. You have to monitor the zeitgeist, as I always say, because these ideas, even if they're not on the surface yet, if they're bubbling underneath, if there's an undercurrent to this, it bears a risk of surfacing at any moment. And when you start to see stuff like what's going on in Portland, that's the tip of the ideological iceberg, so to speak. The resistance folks on Twitter have shown us that what's going on in Portland has pretty broad support amongst sort of your mainstream Democratic activist base. And so there might be copycat movements across the country. You might see people violently attacking federal buildings. And remember, one reason why I said, it was completely implausible, in my opinion, for the United States to have anything like a civil war, is because, these little ragtag Antifa types are not going to be fighting an army or anything like that. But if we do get into a situation where these governors and these mayors and these attorneys general of these various states no longer want to cooperate with the federal government, and they want to protect, their own rioters, that will present a clear challenge of authority to the federal government. And, in doing so, by challenging the Fed's authority, they do erode it in actuality. Because the federal government really has always operated, at the pleasure of the states, except for in the case of the 1860s and the Reconstruction period, in which case the federal government was able to assert its dominance over the states. But I don't think that could ever happen these days, because the way that the media works, and I don't mean like media bias or something like that. I'm talking about with how public pictures are and things like that, and the tolerance of ordinary Americans for that sort of violence. The federal government couldn't just go in and literally conquer Oregon if Oregon decided that they no longer respected federal authority. This would be seen as a tremendous human rights violation. They would see the dead people in the streets, people would be disgusted, and the federal government would lose all legitimacy, or at least most legitimacy, in the eyes of its subjects. And so it wouldn't just be the people, who they're conquering who would see the federal government as illegitimate, but the federal government's own, supposed supporters in the states that are not rebelling would be disgusted, unlike in the 1860s. So if any state ever did decide that they want to secede because there's a growing chorus amongst its citizens, because people are fearing the federal thugs, pulling up in unmarked vans. I mean, putting what I said yesterday aside, the perception is not good. People are perceiving that as a tyrannical act on the part of the federal government, and that has an effect on domestic politics. People on the left are very scared about what's going on. And so if left-wing states start standing up and saying no to federal authority, I think that will be the end of it. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.